This is episode 135 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast.
I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am pleased to be joined for this episode by Dick Minzner. He is a lobbyist. He's an attorney at the Rohde Law Firm, former Secretary of the Tax and Revenue Department, and a Democrat state legislator. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Mr. Minzner.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, Paul.
Yeah, and glad to have someone with all of your many varied experiences to talk a little bit about some of the issues going on in New Mexico public policy. Why don't you just share a little bit how you got involved in all these different aspects of New Mexico public policy, and so people understand kind of where you're coming from.
Okay. Well, I had been practicing law for about 16 years in New Mexico before I ran for the state legislature. I was elected in 1980 and served for 10 years.
What area of the you were in Albuquerque? What area of Albuquerque?
I was an Albuquerque legislator from what was at that time District 25. It was just sort of east of the university, not including the university. It started at about University Boulevard and ran to about San Mateo, and it was north of Lomas and south of Montgomery.
Okay.
So it was the near Northeast Heights.
All right.
And I've always been interested in politics, public policy. I was a government major when I was in college, and so it's something that's always been of interest to me. There seemed to be an opportunity to run for the legislature. I thought I could make a contribution to the people of the state, and I'd like to think that I did. Then after I finished being a legislator, I ran for Attorney General and lost in the primary. But then Bruce King, who was elected governor at that time, asked me to be Secretary of the Tax Department, and I was happy to do it. When I was in the legislature, I had been chairman of the Taxation and Revenue Committee, so that certainly was not a surprising position for him to decide to put me in.
All right. Well, we're definitely going to talk about taxation in New Mexico and your view of taxation. Running the Tax and Revenue Department, I'm sure, is an interesting and ever-changing job, but I'm also sure that doing that job when you did it, which that was what, mid 80s or
it was
late
in the
80s?
Early 90s.
Early 90s.
I was 91 to 94. I was tax secretary.
Okay. That issues are at least somewhat consistent in terms of the way our tax system works and the challenges that you would face in that particular role. But I guess that's the perfect entree into where reform needs to happen in New Mexico and some of the issues facing our tax code. So talk about issues that you faced as Tax and Revenue Secretary and kind of compare and contrast to where we are these days in terms of our tax code and tax enforcement and just the various issues that arise in that area of our government.
Certainly. One of the major issues with respect to the gross receipts tax, both during the time I was in the legislature as tax committee chairman and when I was secretary of the tax department and testifying before the legislature, Governor King was much more accommodating to cabinet officers who wanted to testify on legislation than some of the subsequent governors have been. He, in fact, told us, don't come asking for me to veto a bill if you haven't already testified against it in the legislature. So he really encouraged us to do that. And one of the things that we tried to do when I was secretary and I tried to do when I was chairman was minimize the number of exemptions and deductions that were granted to the gross receipts tax. Every year there would be a number of people who were seeking to have their goods or services exempted from the gross receipts tax. And we basically took the position that our gross receipts tax was designed to be as broad as possible to cover as many items, as many services as possible, so that we could retain a very low base all around. It's acceptable, I think, to have a broad gross receipts tax if, in fact, it's a fairly low gross receipts tax. And we were fairly successful in doing that at that time. The other thing that we tried to do is preserve as much as possible of the gross receipts tax for the state government, basically to fund public schools. And we were very, very careful about parceling out additional gross receipts tax authority to either cities and counties or other local political subdivisions. And I think we were fairly successful in doing that during the period of time I was in the legislature and I was a cabinet secretary.
All right. So talk a little bit about the tax code back then, because you are predating me in terms of my involvement in New Mexico politics, but I'm sure that the gross receipts tax rate was a lot lower. I'm sure it didn't have as many exemptions, but I'm also sure that our personal income tax rate was quite a bit higher. Kind of, without going into too much detail, what are the big changes we've seen in the code since then?
Well, certainly the big changes in the gross receipts tax code have been many deductions and exemptions have been provided, and many grants of local government authority in the gross receipts tax have been parceled out. I think that it was very unusual when I was in the legislature to have and when I was tax secretary, to have any locations that were, higher than 6 or so percent, and now and in fact, I think my recollection is that most of the time, most places were in the 5% area, state and local taxes combined, and now it's certainly not infrequent that you see a city or county whose rate is up above 8%. The income tax was the top rate was higher. We did have we've had some cuts. In fact, there was a very substantial cut during Governor Richardson's time, just cutting off the top, lowering the rates, but only giving that break to the people in the highest income tax bracket. So essentially creating a flat rate, not much in the way of a graduated rate at all. The other
hold on, before you move on, I've got to ask you. You're a former Democrat legislator, still involved in New Mexico politics. We know you don't like the Swiss cheesing, if you will. I'll turn it into a verb of the GRT, and I think we're on the same page, simpatico on that. Do you dislike the rate cuts on the personal income tax? Do you think that was a bad idea? And just to clarify, that was 8.2 to 4.9.
I think I believe in a graduated income tax. I don't mind the rate cuts, but I would like to preserve graduation. It does seem to me that the income tax is the one tax we have that can offset the fact that the gross receipts tax is in some cases fairly regressive because of the fact that lower income people spend a higher percentage of their income on living expenses. They pay than do upper income people. They actually pay a higher percentage of their salaries to gross receipts tax than do people in the upper income tax brackets. Excuse me. So yes, I believe in a graduated income tax. I don't necessarily believe in a high income tax. It seems to me that tax rates are something that are need to be decided on the facts and not ideology. That is, how much do you need to provide the services that you want to provide on the one hand, and how much can the taxpayers afford to pay on the other hand? And there's a tension between those two, and you have to, without unduly burdening the taxpayers or the economy, provide enough revenue for the services that you need or want to fund. And so I think that's not an ideological decision that you can make to say, gee, we really shouldn't have high taxes, or we shouldn't have spending above this percent or that. I mean, it seems to me it's always a fact-based analysis. What do you really think you need to fund your programs, and what can the economy and the taxpayers afford to pay? So, but I do think that once you've decided where you're going to try to go, then you set your tax rates at that level, and that's true whether it's gross receipts, income tax, or even in some cases property tax, which of course is mostly local.
So we can definitely talk about that. There's going to be some natural tension here, even if I got on a call or a conversation with one of the ideologues, libertarian person, someone who I generally see eye to eye with, that we might have our own disagreements, but it's more fun to have these debates with somebody who maybe comes from a slightly different perspective. And former Democrat state legislator, we agree on a lot. But what do you think about the concept of just not taxing income as a concept, that we should not do that because it discourages work in New Mexico, and we need more people at work in New Mexico? And it's one of the challenges that this state faces is people not working in as great a numbers as they do in other states.
Well, if I don't think I would say that's appropriate unless you have decided that you can afford to do that. And if you are going to not tax income, then you either have to say, we're going to raise the gross receipts tax, we're going to raise some other tax, or we're going to cut out this very, very large program. I mean, probably the personal income tax brings in about enough money. I don't recall this off the top of my head, but about enough money to fund the higher ed programs. So if you wanted to eliminate the colleges and universities, then you could eliminate the income tax. If you don't want to make that trade, then you've got to find another one. It is just not possible to have the same amount of programs and eliminate a tax or two. You can, and maybe you decide that some programs can go, but I think it would not be responsible to say, gee, this is what I would like to have as a tax rate. Now you find your program cuts to match it. Just as I don't think it's appropriate for people on the other side to say, here we really ought to have free public education, or we really ought to have totally publicly funded health care. by the way, you find the money now to pay for it. I think if you're going to come up with ideas on the one hand, you probably ought to come up with the offsetting ideas on the other hand.
Well, sure, and we'll talk about the gross receipts tax in a second, but things have definitely changed in New Mexico in a very short amount of time, and we've had this revenue influx thanks to the boom in oil production down in southeast New Mexico. Do you think something has changed fundamentally in New Mexico? Maybe not, totally long term, but we're going to go from 6.3 to $8 billion general fund, and if not eliminating the income tax, for example, which is something that I think is it's not unrealistic, but it's certainly not realistic with the political situation now in New Mexico. How would Dick Minzner attack the tax code given the revenue surpluses that we've seen? What reforms do you think the legislature, I guess, should be looking at from a good government economic growth perspective?
Right. Well, certainly my preference is always to lower the gross receipts tax. And I'm not saying, give more people more exemptions. I'm just saying lower the statewide gross receipts tax.
Would you fill in the gaps to make sure that eliminate those deductions as best you can politically at the same time?
Yes, right. I will say this, that I think Representative Jason Harper, who has been trying to pass a bill that eliminates a number of the gross receipts tax exemptions and deductions, is on the right track. That is, trying to reinstate a much broader gross receipts tax with a lower rate, lower across the board rate. And that, of course, might be something that is achievable now because we can lower the rate in addition by devoting some of the oil and gas money to that cause. I don't feel, even at 5.9%, I don't feel our income tax is particularly high. And I have been exposed to the idea that from business points of view, the level of the personal income tax really has a less impact on the development of businesses than does the gross receipts tax rate. People moving or considering moving to New Mexico or opening branches in New Mexico are used to operating in states where there's a substantial personal income tax, but and of course, that is to a certain extent deductible. The gross receipts tax payments are basically not deductible. And the recent federal tax changes have capped the amount of the income and property tax deductions, but they still exist for many, many people.
And yeah, I definitely agree that the gross receipts tax is the most urgent and serious problem facing New Mexico taxation. It is uniquely harmful to businesses, especially small businesses. I think it depends on, in talking to business owners and leaders, their view of personal income taxes and the rates and how big of a hindrance those are. But, with your extensive background in taxation, share some of your views or personal experiences with businesses or other groups and entities that have been hindered in their efforts to do business in New Mexico by the gross receipts tax. Do you have any horror stories or case studies that you've used over the years?
I don't have colorful stories. I mean, and of course, when I was in the tax department, I really made an effort not to get deeply involved in or knowledgeable about any individual taxpayer's business operation. I mean, it's a matter of talking, I think, more with organizations about general about the general policies and the general effects. Certainly, we've recognized for some period of time that there's a problem with the gross receipts tax for businesses, particularly small businesses, that results from unequal treatment. What you have, if you're a business, a small business, you probably don't have a big enough staff to handle internally your legal work, your accounting work, some of your IT work and the like, and so you parcel that out. And you, as a business, then will be billed for your legal or accounting work and pay gross receipts tax on it. And then, of course, that goes into your cost of doing business, and it goes into your prices or bottom line. For a large business who is big enough that it can take all of that work in-house, they have an in-house legal department, they have an in-house CPAs, they simply hire that work, the employees to do that work, and they don't have to pay gross receipts tax on the work that is done internally. Now, of course, they have to pay income and the like, but when you're farming it out to a different law firm, that's just in a part of the law firm's cost of doing business. So it is really more expensive to do that work for small companies to do that work than for large companies to do that work. That's what's described as pyramiding in the one case, and the company's big enough not to parcel out or contract out that work don't encounter that pyramiding impact. It's always hard, however, when you're talking about tax reform, to get anybody really interested in the fact that you've attacked and solved that problem, because there's hardly any votes turned that are produced by people who understand the pyramiding problem. It's a lot more appropriate to say in a campaign, gee, I got a tax deduction for veterans, I got a tax deduction for senior citizens, I got a tax deduction or some treatment for college students. The problem with tax reform that we consistently run into is that good tax policy is very frequently not really good politics, and that what is good politics is bad tax policy. And I think there's that continuing tension in the political world, and it's not just in New Mexico. I think you see that at in many states and and even at the federal level. The political profit is when you can confer some benefit on some group of people. Just conferring a generally across the board good policy result to the 2 million people in the state is hard to generate votes on.
Well, I certainly agree with you on that. In the economics, we call it the classical diffused benefits but concentrated costs problem, and it goes with any government program that exempts a particular industry or provides benefits to a specific industry at the expense of everybody else. And everybody else doesn't understand, and they don't care about the nickels or dollars that are being filtered away, but that industry often depends 100% on the largesse being provided. We're not quite ready to enter the film subsidy discussion. There's still more to talk about taxation. And specifically, I know you're involved up there. You could have a lot of conversations with people. We are saying, and we're obviously not in the discussions with the governor and her people and some of the legislative leadership, because quite frankly, we find ourselves on the opposite side on a lot of these issues. But my philosophy is, if this governor is going to seriously do something positive for the state of New Mexico and change maybe the reputation of the state and her party when it comes to businesses and business friendliness, she has a once in a generation is not enough. Once in the state of New Mexico kind of opportunity to tackle gross receipts tax, to use some of this money to actually fundamentally transform New Mexico in a positive direction. Do you see this happening? Do you think the stars are finally aligning for gross receipts tax reform, or do you think we'll be like Charlie Brown with the football after Lucy pulls it and we just fly away into the ether?
Right. I'm not particularly optimistic, and again, I don't really attribute it to the governor or the current legislature. I mean, it is just a problem with the nature of politics, as you point out. Generally, if you're doing some tax reform, there will be winners and losers. If you take away some deduction in order to produce, or a lot of deductions in order to create a lower rate, there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. And the saying that people in the tax reform business have is, it's always the case that the screams of the losers are always louder than the cheers of the winners. The screams of the losers basically are based on they've gotten used to a special treatment that they somehow think is inherently ordained or is constitutionally required or something, and the people who are getting the small benefits either won't notice it or take it for granted. They thought they had it coming all along anyway. So it is not easy to imagine, for me to imagine this being accomplished very easily. I think that gross receipts tax reform is very hard. It requires a sophistication on the part of many legislators who really probably think about tax policy only when actually confronted with a bill. I mean, we have tax committees in both houses of the legislature. The Senate Finance is the tax committee on the Senate side. Those people on both those committees think a lot about this, but there's people whose interest is in any of the other 10 or 12 committees in each house, and those people are probably likely to hear from their constituents that, gee, we didn't used to be taxed, and now we're going to be taxed, and we're good people, and we serve the important public need in the customers that we serve, and why should we be losing our non-taxable status? And so it is not. I think it's something that is worth continuing to work on. I think it is something that you might make some improvements in. I am not optimistic about making a lot of change very fast.
Well, Dick, you're depressing me first and foremost, but that's okay. It's not the first time I've been depressed in thinking about New Mexico politics. I'll take one more run at it this way. Most states don't have a gross receipts tax. Most states have a straight sales tax. Now, I know that you lose a decent amount of revenue. And I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on how much revenue we would lose if we went from GRT to sales tax. But how about just a wholesale shift rather than the Harper plan, which is kind of a middle ground, just get rid of the GRT entirely? Because you're right. I agree with you 100%. The GRT is the most serious ongoing obstacle to business formation and creation in New Mexico. And I also understand the politics, but it just seems to point to this never-ending cycle of we're just relying on oil and gas and not really building the private sector in New Mexico. So how about just a shift, jump from GRT to sales?
Okay, certainly the legal difference between gross receipts and sales tax is not something that relates to the scope of the tax. It is a gross receipts tax is a tax where the obligation, where the tax falls on the seller of goods or services. A sales tax falls on the buyer of goods and services, but the seller is obligated to collect it. That's only a technical difference. When most people are talking about the difference between gross receipts tax and sales tax, what they really mean is a tax on only goods is what they think of as a sales tax, and a tax on goods and services is what they're probably talking about when they say a gross receipts
Right.
tax.
That and the pyramiding aspect. Yeah, you're right on.
And so it's the service, it's the pyramiding. We don't have a pyramiding problem too much in goods. We do have it. It's basically in services. And there's the states that have only a sales tax on goods are in many, many cases trying to expand it to services. Services is the growing piece of the economy. And I think now more than 60% of the gross receipts tax revenues are from services. So you're talking about giving up the biggest piece, more than half of the biggest tax producer in the state. It would be more expensive to give up the tax on services, for example, than to give up the personal income tax. The tax on services is the biggest piece of the gross receipts tax and the growing piece of the gross receipts tax. I think when I was secretary, it was about 57% that was from gross receipts tax, but it's certainly much more than that now.
So if we went from gross receipts tax to a sales tax also applying to final sales services, that would basically catch most of the major areas of taxation, but it would eliminate the pyramiding and some of the business to business.
No. I mean, whether it eliminates pyramiding or not depends upon whether you impose it on business to business service transactions. If it was a sales tax, you'd still, whether you call it a gross receipts or a sales tax, you still are going to have the difference between the accounting fees that are charged by your own internal accounting office as opposed to accounting fees charged by the CPA in the next building over. So there is another major difference if you make the tax fall upon the buyer rather than the seller. And that is that a big piece of our revenue comes from taxing the services and the goods that are sold to the federal government at Sandia and Los Alamos National Labs and the military bases. You can't tax the federal government. If you have a sales tax that falls on the buyer and the buyer is the federal government, then you can't collect that tax. If you have a gross receipts tax that falls on the seller, then the people who are selling stuff to the federal institutions get taxed. They will have to incorporate that into the price, of course, of the goods that they sell to the federal government. But that's legitimate. And so, if you want to call it a sales tax and make it fall on the buyer, you are, regardless of how broad or narrow it is, you're deciding not to tax transactions with the federal government. That may be a good idea, it may be not a good idea. It is a fairly expensive idea.
All right. Well, this is why reform is a tough issue in this state. We're going to continue to push hard that we don't pass up this opportunity as a state to actually do something to create real economic growth, real reform. And maybe it's Richardson looked at that and said, well, I could go through with the scalpel and take on the gross receipts tax, but he went in and did the income tax cuts instead. And I totally understand that argument, that viewpoint. So, Dick, another issue, of course, we've talked a little bit about economic incentives, and you have been blessedly one of the few voices, aside from us at the Rio Grande Foundation, at least publicly, talking about the reality of the film industry and the film subsidies. So before we get into that topic, why don't you just share your view of film subsidies kind of from a 30,000-foot issue perspective?
Sure. I think the film subsidy is bad public policy. I think that it is much more expensive in the terms of state money going out the door than in terms versus state money coming in the door than just about any other program, any other tax or economic development program that we have. The report in the legislative session on the changes in the film subsidy basically figure that for every dollar that is spent in terms of the film subsidy, about 40 cents comes back in the form of state and local taxes, most of those being state taxes, but local taxes coming in also. This, by the way, is fairly generous to the industry compared to the computations in a number of other states. Now, they do have in lots of other states somewhat different programs, so the comparisons aren't perfect, but certainly there are states that have figured that they only get 15 cents or 20 cents on the dollar back in terms of their film subsidies. That's why a number of states, I think there's been 9 or so, that have terminated these programs in the last 9 or 10 years. And I do think that it's sort of amazing how successful the film industry has been in persuading so many states to do this when the arithmetic is just clearly adverse to this industry. If anybody's listening and is interested in knowing more about the studies and the work and the commentaries that have been done, there's lots of them, and you can just Google film subsidies evaluated, and you can find reports from the Massachusetts Tax and Revenue Department that did an analysis. You can find Pennsylvania report. You can find articles about what they did and about problems they've encountered in Louisiana. There's just no shortage of knowledge on this, but it doesn't seem to impact the public policy decisions that are made. So I'm going to say again, film subsidies evaluated will produce 40 or 50 articles that are worth reading.
And you cited the 40 cents return for New Mexico. That was from a film office report. I want to say 2015 that was released.
Yes, I think that's that figure may actually have come initially I think there's 2 reports that are discussed in the legislative analysis, which are very similar. One is done by the film office or funded by the film office, and another was actually funded by the Film Employees Union. Both of them came up with a 40-cent return on the dollar, and those are at the high end of where other states have come down. Now, admittedly, there are jobs that are associated with this, and we shouldn't just be concerned with the return to the state. There's the question of jobs. However, the legislative analysis comes to the conclusion that it's about $39,000 of subsidy to create a job. That's scarcely less than it would cost to create jobs just by hiring people. We basically are hiring people to make movies in New Mexico, and we're employing, of course, we're contributing to the employment of some people. There's always been discussion of exactly how many jobs are in the industry, because so many of the jobs are part-time. But there was an interesting article in the Albuquerque Journal about a month or so ago where the film office was reporting, for last year, how many movies were made and how many days of work were provided and how much money was spent in the state. And it showed that for the last several years. And if you do the arithmetic, it comes out to about the equivalent of 1,300 full-time jobs last year. This is in a state where there's 700,000 or 800,000 full-time jobs. In one of the earlier years, I think the year before, it was less than 1,000 full-time jobs. It was about 700 or 800. And the year before that, I think there were more jobs. There might have been 1,800 or so full-time jobs. So it's a very small piece of the total employment picture. And you can read an article that talks about some business moving into the state and intending to hire a few hundred people. And you can see articles about the expected growth of New Mexico employment next year is to be an increase in 20,000 jobs. And the great bulk of these other businesses are operating without any tax subsidy or tax preference. Now, admittedly, there are some who will be moving into the state and they will negotiate some sort of reduction in taxes. But the film industry is unique in that it not only doesn't pay taxes, its subsidies far exceed the taxes that they collect from their vendors and the taxes that their employees pay on their income. That's where the money goes. The money goes to hire people who either work for the film companies or who sell things to the film companies, and the subsidy far exceeds any taxes that are associated with the industry.
Well, and of course and sorry, we have just a minute or so to go, but that's partially because the film industry, you're actually writing checks on an annual basis. The only thing that even resembles that in other New Mexico government economic development policies is LIDA, where they cut checks to get a company to come in one time. Typically, you don't get a second or third or fourth hit at the LIDA funds, but film subsidies you do.
Almost all other tax economic development incentives are 1 year or 2 year or very limited period of time. This, for every job you want to have in the film industry, you have to pay $39,000 a year every year.
Perfect. Well, we got to go. Dick, anything you want to quickly say about any issue we've discussed or ways to find you, or do you want to just remain off the radar? Because I know you're a pretty public guy to begin with.
Well, I just want to say I'm no longer lobbying, so these views that I'm expressing today are entirely my own. They're unaffected by any interest that any of my clients might have had when I was lobbying. I've not lobbied for the last couple of years. And
freedom, in the immortal words
I
of
can
Mel Gibson.
Just express what I think is good public policy.
Well, I appreciate that. And thank you for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter. And tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.